with Cold Harbor. The ranch is located about 7 miles east of Gunnison here in Colorado. And we have an office on Weston's campus that we work out of. Tonight we're hosting, the Applied Sustainability Program is hosting this Wildlife Crossings webinar in collaboration with Anna Markey, who will be a fellow with Cold Harbor next year. This is one of 5 webinars that we're hosting this semester. It's the 3rd one to date. I'm going to give Anna an opportunity to introduce herself. I just want to inform everyone that we are recording this. So if you don't want to be recorded, you're welcome to type your questions into the chat, and I would be happy to facilitate those during the Q&A session. Yeah, Anna, you're welcome to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Anna Markey. I'm a first-year Masters of Environmental Management student, and I'm on the Integrative Public Lands Management track. My background is in mountain lion and black bear research in terms of predator-prey relationships with deer and elk. But tonight I'm here to talk to you about wildlife crossings. So I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have a story where we are driving and narrowly missed a squirrel or a bird. And those of us who are less fortunate may have a story of getting into an accident with a deer, or if you live out west and are very unfortunate, you may have been involved in or witnessed an accident with an elk. I personally have narrowly missed hitting an alligator in Florida and somehow swerved around a beaver in the deserts of Utah, of all places. These accidents where a motorist actually collides with an animal are termed wildlife vehicle collisions. And over 300,000 wildlife vehicle collisions occur in the United States annually. But this is only the number of incidents that are reported to the police or the State Department of Transportation. There are most surely more incidents that are not reported, particularly incidents with smaller animals such as like squirrels or chipmunks. Of these 300,000 reported incidents, over 24,000 are fatal to the animal and up to 2,000 are fatal to the driver. Between body damage to the vehicle, roadside cleanup, insurance fees, and potential hospital bills, these collisions with wildlife can cost nearly $8.4 billion a year. So this is a state FART map created called The Chances of Hitting a Deer in My State. And they created this between 2017 and 2018. So if you're here in Colorado, you have a 1 in 277 chance of hitting a deer when you go out on a drive to the store, to work, or on a road trip to another place. So with this number, Colorado is considered a medium risk state of hitting a deer, and other states have higher risks. Take West Virginia. If you're from West Virginia or driving through the state, you have a 1 in 46 chance of hitting a deer. This can be due to a multitude of factors such as human population density, deer population density, traffic levels, and roadway placement in areas with low visibility, such as mountainous terrain with lots of twists and turns. The numbers may be a little different now 3 years later in states such as Colorado, which added wildlife fencing and wildlife crossing signs along highways. In early 2020, 15 miles of 8-foot tall wildlife fencing was installed on both sides of Interstate 25. And since 2013, the Colorado Department of Transportation has worked along Interstate 70 and installed 48 miles of wildlife fencing, 54 wildlife escape ramps, which are one-way soil ramps, and we'll talk about those later, and 15 deer guards, which are kind of wider cattle guards for deer and elk, and we'll also talk about those later. So here in Colorado, there are an average of 3,300 wildlife vehicle collisions each year. That number could be higher, and like as high as 4,000 collisions annually, because the 3,300 statistic does not include collisions with wildlife reported by law enforcement. In Colorado, wildlife is the 3rd leading cause for vehicle crashes in some areas of the state, report that up to 70% of automobile accidents are caused by wildlife. It is estimated that each collision accounts to over $3,000 in property damage, and the number of wildlife vehicle collisions in Colorado doubled over a 7-year period from 1998 to 2004. I'm sure the numbers have continued to rise and will continue to rise as more and more cars travel along these major roadways. There are many factors that go into wildlife vehicle collision probability. Factors such as traffic and speed increase the probability of getting into a collision. Animal abundance and road width also increases the probability because it takes quite a while longer for wildlife to cross a 6-lane highway than a 2-lane highway, and even longer when there are concrete or metal barriers. Also, if you see one animal, there are bound to be more behind it that you may not have noticed. There are factors that can increase or decrease the probability of a collision with wildlife, and they include viable wildlife habitat or lack thereof near the roadway, time of year, and roadside vegetation levels. One can always reduce their chances of being in a wildlife vehicle collision by paying attention to the side of the road and always being aware of your surroundings. Here in Colorado, especially in the mountains, there are special factors to be aware of when it comes to wildlife on roadways. Daylight savings time is a major factor, and one that I didn't take into much consideration at first. So wildlife tends to move more frequently at dusk and dawn, and in fall during daylight savings, when the clocks fall back an hour and it starts to get darker earlier, there is more traffic on the road at dusk when wildlife is moving for people coming home from work. And then mating seasons are also important to think about because deer and elk have rut seasons where the males are looking for females to mate with. And my mom was driving during rut season at one point, and a deer ran out into the road and collided with her car, and it sent his antlers straight through the front windshield. Thankfully, no one was hurt, and then some stranger was able to have venison for dinner that night. And I'm originally from South Carolina, so I never thought about snow impacting the probability of getting to an accident. But when there are big snow events and snowplows come through, snow is pushed up on the sides of the road, creating almost like a frozen blockade. Wildlife can get down them onto the road fairly easily, but tend to get stuck on the roadway trying to get back out. And one last factor to consider is migration routes of wildlife, especially along wildlife corridors. And wildlife corridors, if you don't know, are strips of habitat connecting wildlife populations that are otherwise separated by human infrastructure and development. So here in Gunnison, we are lucky to have the regenerative laboratory known as Cold Harbor Institute. And in 2019, a Master's of Environmental Management alum identified a wildlife corridor on the property that crosses Highway 50 on the way into town. So the black outline you can see is the Cold Harbor property. The red line is Highway 50 and State Highway 114. And the yellow lines are the elk migration patterns within the relative migration corridors. Obviously, animals don't travel in a straight line all the time from one place to the other. And where the elk migration route crosses Highway 50 is of particular interest when it comes to the potential of wildlife vehicle collisions, and that's around here. This migration corridor was identified as one of the top 10 migration routes for mule deer and elk in Colorado. And these corridors are used by wildlife to reach seasonal habitat that can provide adequate forage, mating grounds, and water sources. And the Tamichi River runs through the property, and 243 of the 334 acres that make up the property are under a conservation easement. This in turn provides pristine wildlife habitat with access to lush forage and clean drinking water, a haven for wildlife, if you will. So there are various ways to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, and the techniques mainly used are road signs, fencing along highways, overpasses and underpasses, and others that I mentioned earlier and recently learned about, such as wildlife escape ramps, and deer and elk guards are also useful. So let's dive in. So the nice thing about road signs is that they tend to be low cost and simple to put out on the side of the roadway. There is some speculation about simple road signs with pictures of deer or elk get lost in the background and motorists don't really pay attention to them. Instead of standalone signs, there have been implementation of signs with motion sensors that when they detect an animal, they set off flashing lights on the sign to warn motorists of the presence of that animal. And other ways to help reduce wildlife vehicle collisions through signs is by having reduced speed signs at night. So they don't really show the picture of the animal, but they say, you know, after 6 p.m., reduce your speed from 65 to 45. And this helps decrease the distance needed for a vehicle to come to a complete stop if the motorist comes upon an animal in the road. There are also programmable signs that hang over roadways that can change messages and warn motorists to watch for wildlife during certain migration and mating seasons. There's wildlife fencing, which is shown to be an effective tool to keep animals off the roads. However, it is quite expensive. It can cost upwards of $100,000 for a single mile of fencing. Fencing can also cut off wildlife from their typical migration routes, leading to seasonal habitats and food and water sources. In some cases, fencing may not be effective. When I was working in Florida, there would be counts of Florida panthers getting hit by cars because they didn't care about fences and would simply jump them. And bears were also known to climb the wildlife fences. So in addition to fencing, you have a wildlife escape ramp. And these are one-way ramps often made of dirt and soil. This is kind of the backside of one from the road. And they allow wildlife to be able to get off the highway easily, especially because they are built with conjunction with fencing. And they were added onto these fencing projects in order to prevent wildlife from getting onto the roadway due to a piece of broken fencing or animal jumping over at a low point and then getting stuck when they just see more fencing on the other side of the road. These escape ramps are considered one way because the animal can jump down from the ramp fairly easily, but if they came across the backside of the ramp, they're unlikely to try and jump up onto it. There are smaller versions of these ramps that can help save smaller animals such as frogs and squirrels, or even birds that get stuck in your pool, or if you have livestock troughs. If you do have livestock troughs, you can get a set of 4 escape ramps for as low as $75 to $90. So these are deer. This is an example of a deer and elk guard, and they're basically wide cattle guards. And if you don't know what a cattle guard is, it's a grid made of metal bars or tubes that allow for humans and vehicles to pass over, but prevent cattle and other livestock from crossing. So animals tend to look at them and don't see solid ground, but rather open space underneath the metal tubes, and they don't cross them. Deer and elk guards follow the same concept, except they are wider than traditional cattle guards, and this is to prevent deer and elk from simply jumping over them. These guards can be placed along roadways or intersections leading onto major highways in order to prevent ungulates and other wildlife from even entering onto the roadway. And these can cost roughly $2,500 to $3,000 to install. So an overpass is a human-made bridge over a roadway or highway system. But instead of pedestrian bridges that are generally just some concrete or asphalt made for human use, overpasses generally have rocks, dirt, grasses, and even trees to allow wildlife to more comfortably use them. Overpasses allow animals to continue to migrate and connect habitats without the risk of them being on the road. These can also be rather costly, and they cost somewhere in the ballpark of $2 to $4 million to build and landscape, and potentially more depending on how big the roadway is that it's being built over. There is some speculation about whether or not they are useful. My personal belief, and this is part of my project, is that If an overpass is in an area and it's deemed to be unuseful, it might be because they aren't constructed in the right area of heavy animal traffic or following natural migration routes for wildlife. So underpasses require a little more forethought and planning. They can be added on after a roadway is built or planned in advance during the initial construction and paving of the roadway. So these are tunnels under roadways that allow for both terrestrial and aquatic wildlife movement depending on location. The nice thing about underpasses is that they tend to cost only a tenth of what it costs to build an overpass. So say an overpass averages around $3 million, it would be safe to guess that an underpass would cost roughly $300,000, which is really nice. So these are a nice alternative to costly overpass and provide the exact same function. So there are two types of underpasses. The first type is a terrestrial underpass, and terrestrial underpasses are dry. These are meant for mammals, particularly for large mammals such as deer, elk, bears, mountain lions, and they pose more of a threat on roadways and can cause significant amount of damage if you were to get in a collision with them. Smaller mammals such as coyotes, foxes, and badgers also benefit greatly from them. The second type of underpass is the aquatic underpass, and aquatic underpasses are much less common. And I didn't really know about them until I encountered them working in the Everglades in Florida. And the need didn't really cross my mind until I was living in a very wet place. And aquatic underpasses obviously have some level of water running underneath them and can connect fish populations, amphibian populations, and in the case of Florida, even alligator populations. So I'm about to start my second year's master's project, and this will involve setting up trail cameras along Cold Harbor's property that borders the highway on both sides of Highway 50. I plan on going through all the camera photos to determine where ungulates and wildlife in general tend to congregate the most and hopefully see the areas and direction they cross Highway 50 most often. This information could help with the decision-making and placement of an overpass or underpass if that project is ever undertaken by the county and the Colorado Department of Transportation. But most importantly, I hope the findings of this project and this webinar help us all to be more aware of wildlife and the potential for wildlife to be on roads so we can all be safer and be one valley. With proper installation of wildlife fencing, along with underpasses and overpasses, and most importantly, motorist awareness, I believe wildlife vehicle collisions could be reduced by up to 80%. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. My email is down on the bottom in case you want to contact me. Also, make sure to check out the poster and the blog post on wildlife crossings on Cold Harbor's website. And if you have any questions, I'll take them now.
I actually have a question. Thank you. That was really cool. I hadn't ever heard about wildlife crossings until the MEM. And I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but what would why would one choose to have an overpass as opposed to an underpass if you can put it in the same place and one is less expensive than the other?
Yeah, I think a lot of people know of overpasses more, and it helps if like the road is kind of flat and you don't have an ability to kind of raise it up. Like a lot of times, at least in Florida, there were trenches on the sides of roadways. And so it allowed for underpasses to be dug easily underneath the roadway. Where if you're just, say, in Kansas, it's just completely flat, the animal's probably not going to use the underpass because why would it go down to come back up? It would just go straight across. So I think some people, if there are trees or anything lining it, they choose an overpass because they can kind of blend it more into the landscape.
Okay, cool. Thank you. There is a question from Jenny. She asks if you know why reports from law enforcement aren't included in the number of collisions in Colorado.
I'm actually not sure. I would beg to guess that a lot of it just has to do with they keep their reports separate for some reason, and I think it was easier for, like, the Colorado Department of Transportation to simply, take their numbers that they put in their database or their system that they keep track of and simply report those than try to go to all the small sheriff or police stations in the towns to get those numbers.
Cool. Brian asks if you know about the state's process for getting wildlife signs installed. He says, I heard there needs to be a certain number of strikes within a designated time frame to qualify for a sign, as CDOT wants to limit excessive signage.
Yes, so I attempted to get a sign installed around Cold Harbor, and it was a lot of emailing back and forth and asking questions. And I got quite a bit of pushback simply because, they didn't want to have to go through the whole process. So that's where I got the information that they don't think signage is effective and that it just becomes background noise. And I completely understand that because you don't want excessive signage. But it would be interesting to know if there's actually a process that gets a sign put up. If anyone knows, let me know.
I actually wonder if Chloe has any idea. I'm not entirely sure what she's doing, but I have a feeling it's similar or something in the same sort of area of study. Does anyone have any other questions? Eileen asks or states, I'm not sure, in regards to signs, she's curious to know what signs would be most impactful for human awareness, but also would be the least impactful on wildlife activity. Bright lights are harmful to nocturnal species and have been known to be harmful. Kind of a question on Anna's opinion.
Yeah, I like to think that as long as people are more aware, you wouldn't need signage. I like the idea of um, the motion sensing ones that do use flashing lights just because animals tend to move during dawn and dusk anyway, so it's kind of getting light out. It does beg the question though, like if for some reason a blade of grass is waving in front of the motion sensor in a specific way, then it's just flashing all the time. And I've done a project with anthropogenic or human produced noise, and it changed the frequency of bird pitches. So I'm sure if there's a ton of flashing lights, that would also change their natural circadian rhythm. And so, yeah, I think it would be great if we all just could be more aware of things and have these infrastructures built to help wildlife. But unfortunately, it might be just a giant sign on the side of the road without lights help it the most.
Cool, thank you. Any other questions? Abe asks, how do you make sure the animals use your crossing versus just crossing the road? Really tall fences, anything else? I guess, would this relate to the research that Ashley did on her project specifically with Cold Harbor?
Yeah, so Ashley Merkel kind of found the wildlife corridor, and I've talked with people in CPW, and they have some collared deer and elk, which also helps getting that information of where they cross the most. So I think placement is really big because obviously, like, you don't want to place one in the middle of town if deer and elk aren't crossing in the middle of town. So if you follow a lot of those just natural migration routes, I think that helps. And putting up fencing along them to kind of lead them in. I think that would be the best bet, besides just knowing where they're going anyway. Like we have the continental divide around here, and most animals during migration season try to get up and over it, but they take the same routes each time because animals want to travel in the path of least resistance. They don't want to just go up a mountain, then down a mountain, up a mountain, down a mountain. They're going to find the nice saddle in between mountains that stretch for a really long time. So it's easy to travel with really good food. But yeah, I would say just kind of knowing where they cross and then unfortunately kind of leading them towards the overpass or underpass.
Arlo, do you have your hand raised?
I do, yes. Thanks. Just to put it in context, where I live, it's got the 2 largest elk herds in the United States. And so the vehicle animal conflict's pretty significant. And, you know, a lot of those corridors have been recognized. And one of the processes or one of the methods that they've used, which I didn't hear mentioned, maybe I missed it, was it's a series of reflectors that when the headlights hit it, they pass the light through and they connect to form a visual barrier. So as a vehicle's driving at night anyway, it creates this visual barrier using these reflectors off of its own headlights, and it deters the animals from crossing. Are you familiar with that?
That's interesting. I never like saw or heard of that. Do you
It,
know if that's been
it significantly changed, you know, and just one area in particular I'm thinking of, you know, where there was hundreds of incidences a season or a year to a handful.
do you know if it helps during the day as well?
I doubt it. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool, thank you. I can't see everybody, so if anybody else does have their hand raised, you're welcome to just speak up. Yeah, I don't know.
I have a question about your trail cameras, and if you're not there in your study design, that's totally cool, but I'm just curious about like what responses you're looking for. I think you were saying like presence and then also like direction of travel. But then in that map that you showed, it looked like the migration area was like pretty large around those corridors. And so like, I wonder how much difference there's going to be throughout the Cold Harbor property.
That is what I'm curious about because, you know, they can kind of go anywhere. So I'm hoping to put cameras within a 300-meter distance of each other. So that way there's less probability of 2 cameras picking up the same deer or elk at the same time. And so what I'm gonna do is pretty much take each camera, they'll each have a name and like a GPS location associated with them. And as I go through photos, I'll see how many individual animals are there, and then compare that if like say in one day I capture 10 elk on one camera and 100 on another, that'll be kind of the detection rate. And with that, I hope to create a heat map, at least within Cold Harbor's property on both sides of the highway, to see kind of if there's any variation. Because it seems like the corridor might be more on the east side of the property. So I'm hoping to try to see if that's correct or if they're just along the entire property in general.
Super cool. Thank you. And way to be on top of your study design.
I have a follow-up to that. Can you use roadkill data or do roadkill surveys in addition to your camera data? I hit a deer right next to the turnoff to Cold Harbor 2 years ago, and there was something like 20 dead deer on the road in that one spot. And like, maybe doing some surveys of before people, I don't know how quickly the highway removes them, but just to help build on that data.
And I do hope to use some of that data. I hope I don't end up hitting a deer, but it would be kind of ironic if that were to happen while I study this. But I hope to get in contact with someone to get that data, because I don't know how fast they pick it up. I think it was in Florida, they had people monitoring at like 6 a.m. And I don't know if I want to get up at 5:30 each morning to go get roadkill data. But it would be interesting if I could get that just to see. So I think I was talking with Kevin from CPW, and he said there were times when there were huge herds of elk moving through, and it would be 5-10 elk being hit in a single day. So it'd be interesting to see if there were certain days and certain times of the year when I have my cameras out, if like those numbers pick up significantly.
What is your timeline? When do you put the cameras out, and then when are you bringing them back to start looking at the data?
So right now I have a request put in with CPW to borrow Chloe's cameras, and I'm hoping by the end of next week I might get those, and then a week after that I can start putting them out. So I'm honestly hoping for April. That would be great, if not maybe May, and then picking them back up, let's say 11 or 12 months later. Like I'd like to get a whole year's view, so that way you can get kind of the spring summer migration and the fall winter migration of all these animals moving around.
Will that give you enough time to look at all the images before having to create your deliverables?
I would think so, with potential for someone to also carry on with it if they want, or if someone else also wants to help me, I'm always willing to take volunteers and teach people and even go out and check cameras with everyone. But yeah, I think it would be cool to at least set up as much as I can, but then getting that data for a long period of time.
Cool, thank you.
I have one more follow-up question. So considering that Colorado just passed the ballot to reintroduce wolves into the state, and I know it's not happening by the time your project is going to be done, I'm curious, are you going to like set up potential projects for future MEMers who, because with wolf presence, migration and herd behavior changes. So are you going to set up something that, somebody can do in the future as far as like how overpass and underpass can be constructed based on that behavior, or if that made any sense?
Yes. Thankfully, I will be the research coordinator with Cold Harbor. So if other people have projects even currently that they want to try on the property, hopefully I'll be able to help facilitate those projects and even undergrad projects. And then it would be really cool with the migration of wolves in and the reintroduction. It would definitely be interesting to see. I know it won't happen in the next year. It might be the next 5 or 10 years. But I hope this information could be provided to CPW or CDOT or anyone, that eventually if they do put in an underpass or an overpass or fencing or anything, they'd know kind of the best places to put it.
Cool. Well, I guess if anyone has any questions that come to mind, you're welcome to send Anna an email. Her email is at the bottom of the slideshow. Thank you so much for, I guess, spreading awareness. It's only the second time I've ever learned about this, and the first time was actually a lot more specific, and they only really spoke about overpasses, so I'd never heard about all the other options out there. So I appreciate you sharing all of the things that you've learned. Yeah, If anyone has anything that they'd like to ask Anna, you're welcome to send an email.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming.
Well, I guess everybody have a good evening. Thanks, Anna.